Good evening. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to see you tonight. My name is Sandra de Castro Buffington, and I'm the founding director of the Global Media Center for Social Impact. We're based at the School of Public Health at UCLA. Our social channel is at GM Impact, and we call ourselves GMI for short. So we'd love to hear from you. It's really important for us to get your feedback and to hear your thoughts and ideas. So please do tweet if you like. At the Global Media Center, we recognize the profound impact of storytelling to transform our world. And so we serve as a free resource to the entertainment industry to inspire storylines of social impact on topics such as mass incarceration, racial justice, immigration, LGBT and gender equality, disability, health, climate change, and more. And we also support viewers' desire to make a difference by providing them with tools to help them take action individually and collectively in their communities. We're so pleased to bring together this extraordinary group of experts for the panel, 12 More Years a Slave? Is Mass Incarceration the New Slavery? 3 quick facts. The U.S. prison population has more than quadrupled since 1980. The largest single factor in this increase, longer drug sentences. 1/3 of black men can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. This is unacceptable. The solutions we'll hear tonight go way beyond policy change. The prison reform community has many tools, and storytelling is one of the most powerful tools of all. Tonight we'll hear real stories of real people and the ways in which experts, artists, and activists are impacting millions of lives across the country. We'll also hear from TV writers who tell compelling prison-related storylines and bring viewers back over and over again for more. What these writers are doing is not simply entertaining their audiences. We know that viewers are often learning something important in the process. In fact, these shows can transform our society as a whole. And it always takes a deeply committed and visionary writer to bring a storyline to life. Thank you, Michael. That's okay. Good emphasis. So, okay. This weekend, GMI will be taking a small group of writers on what we call a story impact tour. And this is something that Neal, Baer, and I created a few years ago. And we're going to Ironwood State Prison so that writers can meet people behind bars, hear their stories, and actually get some direct experience of their living conditions. And this is just one of the ways that we help writers make their storylines more compelling by making them more realistic and accurate. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our amazing panelists. And I'm going to start by introducing hip-hop artist, prison activist, poet, actor, author, and educator, Bryonn Bain. Wrongfully imprisoned during his second year at Harvard Law School, Bryonn sued the NYPD and won. He developed Lyrics from Lockdown, a one-man show in which he portrays 40 characters and tells 2 stories of wrongful incarceration. The great Harry Belafonte said, "The world needs to see how Bryonn Bain's Lyrics from Lockdown carries the tradition of joining art and activism as an instrument of justice at a time when the prison system has our communities in crisis." Bryonn performs in prisons, theaters, and universities worldwide. So let's welcome Bryonn. And next, I'd like to present Scott Budnick. Scott grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and graduated from Emory with degrees in business and film. As executive producer of Green Hat Films, Budnik executive produced many successful comedies, including the highest grossing rated R comedies in history, the Hangover series. Outside of film, Budnik is a fierce champion for children in need. He's a teacher and board member at Inside Out Writers, and I know we have other members of Inside Out Writers here tonight. He founded and is growing the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, ARC, and for his work with youth in the criminal justice system, Governor Jerry Brown named Budnik California's Volunteer of the Year in 2012. Scott is currently launching a new production company. Let's welcome Scott. Next, I'd like to introduce James Anderson. James grew up in Los Angeles County and at a young age became involved in drugs and gangs. And having experienced physical and emotional abuse, he believed the world had nothing positive to offer and thought he was destined for life behind bars. During the last incarceration, James was facing a lengthy sentence, but he went through an amazing transformation and made a commitment to dedicate his life to helping others. Since his release 2 years ago, James has traveled extensively to speak at schools and conferences, inspiring hope and raising awareness. James was hired as the first full-time employee at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition and has mentored many people who've been released from prison. Let's welcome James. And last, but definitely not least, I'd like to present Dr. Neal Baer. Neal is a Harvard-trained pediatrician. He's a television writer who combines his passion for medicine and storytelling to challenge audiences' views on a spectrum of social and political topics. Prior to his work as executive producer of Under the Dome, Neal was executive producer of Law and Order, SVU, and of the NBC hit series ER. Neal joined me at UCLA to found the Global Media Center for Social Impact, and he established the Center for Storytelling, Activism, and Health, now at UCLA, where he's using new media to promote health initiatives worldwide. Let's welcome Neal. So the way the evening will go, I'm going to sit down, and we're going to invite Bryonn to speak first. And first, we'll see a short clip of his work. Thank you.
Set me free, 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 set me free.
I started performing hip-hop spoken word in the late 1980s with my brothers and my cousins in New York prisons. And then in the late 90s, we found ourselves locked up for something we didn't do.
Every black man baggy pants in the crib.
And that experience has changed my life. The story that I wrote about the experience, walking while black, Bill of Rights for Black Men, blew up and was this whole freaking nation media event that happened because I was a law student at Harvard. It really was an opportunity to talk about issues that have been affecting brothers across the country for a very long time and still to this day.
So you are. You got to walk on. They are. No one else doesn't come to leave me. Star the cops with my crops like I'm a porno star. Yo!
I started getting letters from death row saying, brother, please keep saying what you're saying because they don't believe us.
Dear Bryonn, I read everything I could find on you. You write pretty good. What you should write about is what goes on in here.
Brothers hard enough they are.
The show opened at the Hip Hop Theater Festival in New York City. Since then, we've been to Belgium, we've been to Asia, we sold out in Singapore. So this is just the beginning. I want people who watch Lyrics from Lockdown to be reminded of our common humanity. I think that consciousness needs to be contagious. That consciousness needs to be more addictive than crack. I ran into Dave Chappelle in Yellow Springs, Ohio. He was like, Bryonn, are the police after you still?
Hello. Thank you. Oh man, it's crazy to look at that. It's amazing what Photoshop can do. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here today with my esteemed panelists. I feel like it's appropriate to kind of kick this off, given the topic, with bringing the energy of the ancestors, on whose shoulders we stand into the room. And so, I think of the first thing that comes to mind is Harriet Tubman, right? And how, after making repeat trips to bring folks out of slavery, was asked about that, and she said, "You know what? I could have freed so many more folks if they just knew they were slaves." Right? That definitely comes to mind, like the awareness of us, of all of us, I think, and how we participate in this system that is incarcerating more people than any other society in human history. I think it's important for us to understand our role, our complicity, and to fully understand what we can do to actually turn the tide and change things in another direction. The second thing I think about is Mr. Belafonte was mentioned. He's been a great mentor for me, and in addition to being the executive producer of the show, and he shared with me the words of an old Polish workers anthem that said, and I wish I could do it in his voice, but he says, "Calculate carefully and ponder it well, and remember this when you do. My two hands are mine to sell. They built your machines, they can stop them too." And that, for me, I think captures the spirit that I want to bring to this conversation, which is not just focus on, I want to talk about the connections between slavery and incarceration, but I also want to talk about the connection between solutions and the idea of this movement, the abolition movement that ended chattel slavery, and the spirit of that being invoked in the critical, urgent life and death work that so many of us are engaged in today. There are three very simple, very basic connections that I think come to mind for me in thinking about the connection between mass incarceration and enslavement. First being, most obviously, confinement, right? The inhumane confinement that is so dehumanizing. Malcolm X talked about how it's just to put people behind bars and in cages is such a dehumanizing thing. And the long-term effects of that, the trauma that's caused when folks are confined, put in a hole, all the experiences there. 200,000 men I talked about earlier were reportedly raped last year in prisons across the country. The effects of that when folks come home without a chance to sort of decompress and to have their trauma treated. So the confinement issue is a connection between slavery and incarceration. Certainly, prisons is used for social control for black and brown folks and working and poor white folks across the country. There's a direct connection there. A second connection is the violence, being subject to violence, wanton violence. Cornel West, who I had for a class a couple years ago, he said, that 9/11 was significant for many reasons, but for most of America, it was the niggerization of America. It was most of America was made to feel the way black folks have always had to feel in this country, and you could be subjected to violence at the whim of those in power, right? At any moment, right? And that is the experience of black folks coming into this country. And so the vulnerability that black folks have always felt throughout American history, the entire nation was forced to experience that. And so the term niggerization, in terms of the violence that folks experience in prison, I think is another connection between slavery and incarceration. And thirdly, the exploitation of labor. And the fact that Dell Computers and Victoria's Secret has brothers and sisters making thongs in prison. MCI has hiked up the phone. We know the hiked up prices for making phone calls, double and triple the amounts. Folks getting paid 10 to 15 cents an hour to do work. So all of those are three of the core connections that I think about in the work that we're doing. I work with the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions in New York City. It's the first research think tank founded and run by formerly incarcerated professionals. Brother Divine Pryor here is the executive director of New Leadership. Very glad to have him in the room with us today. And I think a part of the work that, what I've learned in that work is that you cannot have a movement to end mass incarceration, whether you're committed to the abolition of the prison crisis or there's the reform of the policies that maintain the system. You can't have that without having incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people at the leadership of the movement. You wouldn't have a feminist movement that was run by men. You would not have a movement for black liberation run by white folks in the leadership. You could not have a movement for queer justice with straight folks at the leadership. You cannot have a movement to end mass incarceration without people who have been incarcerated, who are incarcerated at the leadership of that movement. And so whatever the policy experts say, I want to make sure that hits home, that this movement that we are all a part of and we're figuring out ways to be engaged in, we actually are finding ways to make sure folks who are closest to the problem, you know, we also take advantage of the fact that they're closest to the solution.
Bryonn, thank you for those comments. I wanted to ask you, you talked earlier today about envisioning a new reality and to approach solutions from that standpoint. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the work of artists, right, part of the work of artists is to imagine something better, right? You know, I think part of, you know, what inspires me to be an artist, right, is, you know, poet Saul Williams. He says this line, he says, he believes in art, in the concept of thou art God, like the connection between us and God, something greater than ourselves, right? That's one way of thinking about it. The other connection is, I talk about Anne Bogart, the theater director, who talks about art as aesthetics. And anesthetics put you to sleep, right? They numb the pain, they make you not feel. And aesthetics being something that actually opens you to feeling, that wakes you up. So art as an alarm clock to wake us up to what the hell's going on, right? In our country, in our communities, you know, more black and brown folks incarcerated, 4 times as many black men incarcerated here as were under apartheid in South Africa. We knew that was a racist regime. There was no doubt about that, right? You know, but at the same time, white folks live in gated communities more than ever before. So we're living in this culture of fear, and that I think is forcing us to see ourselves in a certain way. We need to envision possibilities that are greater than those that we're trapped in right now. And I think that's the first step towards actually creating that reality. There was a time when folks thought slavery would not formally be abolished. There was a time when folks thought women would never have the right to vote. There was a time when, you know, these things that could have passed were believed to not be possible, but there was a small group of folks who actually envisioned it, who saw it, who imagined it, and that group actually catalyzed the changes that needed to happen. And so I think that's part of our role now, is to actually see the future that we want to build so that we can take the steps to get there.
Thank you. Well, so we're now going to go to Scott Budnick, and we'll start with a short clip about his work. Let's take a look.
Time now for our Making a Difference report tonight. It is hard to imagine a bigger contrast than the one between the worlds of Hollywood power players and those in California's criminal justice system. But there is a program that brings these two worlds together, and it's making a difference for young people who might otherwise be completely lost. Chelsea Clinton has tonight's Making a Difference report.
I wasn't supposed to come to jail. I was supposed to be free in the world.
I want to change and make my mother proud.
They may be young, but these teens are writing about their grown-up struggles in poetry and prose.
Another with crazy thoughts in mind, another eye for an eye makes the other eye go blind.
It's called Inside Out Writers. This innovative California program allows hundreds of juveniles, some facing decades in prison, to find their voice.
To a lot of the public, these kids are disposable. These kids are just like voiceless. They're forgotten.
Scott Budnick is known for his work producing the popular Hangover movies, but he also volunteers at a juvenile hall in Los Angeles. After years of teaching classes, Scott Budnick met Prophet Walker, then a teenager, sentenced to 6 years for assault.
The more I began to read of Malcolm X and Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all these great figures, I was like, wow, I can do something better.
When Prophet left the juvenile system and went to adult prison, he found a totally different world.
It's Jim Crow South inside prison. There's benches for races, there's water fountains for races.
I saw them here as young kids. I then had to watch them go into an adult prison system that, if no one intervenes, is just going to grind them up and spit them out.
And that's when Budnick and Walker had an idea.
X-coordinate is straight across.
A college program for young offenders in adult prison. It rewards inmates who behave well and want to learn. letting them study together and live together, like this one at CRC Norco. Now the program is spreading to prisons across the state. For student inmates like Anthony Alfaro, it gives them hope.
Do you remember the moment when you believed that you could have a different future?
Getting that first report card and having all A's, and I was like, okay, I could do this. I could do this.
Prophet Walker is now out of prison, earning his engineering degree at Loyola Marymount University. He says the college program changed him.
It's when you begin to believe in yourself and accept the power that you have, how great you could be.
I've given myself time, space, and attention to grow.
Back at Inside Out Writers,
Beautiful, man.
those young dreams could not be contained.
It gets me out of this, like these walls around me. I have my own freedom when I write.
Prophet Walker was the first graduate from the college program. Today, 75 inmates have graduated, and currently hundreds more are enrolled. The return rate to prison for inmates from some of these college programs drops below 3%. The state average is higher than 60.
Huge population yet to go, but every little bit counts. Chelsea Clinton, as always, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
with us.
So first off, since we're at the Writers Guild, I'm going to recruit teachers for Inside Out Writers. We do 45 classes a week in the juvenile halls, and we have 45 professional writers teaching those classes, but we need subs. So if anyone can do 2 hours a week or 2 hours a month or any couple months, please come forward. We'd love for your help. So it's been an interesting journey. Came here from Atlanta. Was here for 4 years working as an assistant to Todd Phillips. My first job was working on his film Road Trip, where I became his assistant, and then Old School, and then started producing with him and ran his production company for the 10 years after that, 14 years total. I dare say for the first 4 years I was here in Los Angeles, I felt trapped in the Hollywood bubble, going to the same restaurants and parties and talking about the same open directing assignments and open writing assignments, and it made me a little nauseous. And I realized that there was so much happening in our city 10 miles away that we were just completely clueless about and separated from. And to be honest, I was really unhappy living here. And another friend of mine who worked for another filmmaker said, I teach a creative writing class in Juvenile Hall, come check it out. And I did. And that was 2003. And I've taught that class every Saturday since. It's completely and totally changed my life. I feel like I have a much bigger purpose than just making films. And the journey's been truly amazing. I'll kind of take you through that journey in a second, but one of the craziest things is after 14 years of running that company, talking about the theme of tonight, I saw 12 Years a Slave, and it hit me so incredibly hard. I'm from Atlanta, and that movie just rocked me so hard. I mean, I grew up with half my friends being black. I thought I understood the black experience, and I realized after seeing that movie that I just didn't understand anything. And it really made me question the kind of films I was making. We were on our 11th comedy, and I really wanted to focus on starting the nonprofit and then focus on making films of real substantial issues. And I'm incredibly proud of all the comedies we did, and I think it's important to make people laugh. I think that's crucial, and I really am appreciative to Todd Phillips, who's my brother and who I worked with for 14 years. But now it's time to get serious, and I really feel like we have the power to really move people's perception on issues that are incredibly important. I have a friend of mine in Atlanta who is a kind of redneck Republican who always wants to talk about poverty and always goes to the statement of people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. And not that I don't think he quite realizes that they don't have boots or bootstraps. But he went and he saw 12 Years a Slave, and the call I got was, wow, that he realized he's been wrong his entire life. And that movie affected him in that way, to realize that his view on race, his view on poverty, that he's been wrong. And I like working with kids who commit crimes because I believe that their worst act is not something that should define them their entire lives. Same thing for the redneck Republican. I believe everyone has the capacity to change, especially children. So I walked into Silmar Juvenile Hall in 2003 and sat at a table with 10 kids facing life in prison at 14, 15, 16 years old. The kid sitting next to me, David Negretti, had just received a 300-year sentence for standing next to someone that shot someone in the butt. Attempted murder, not the shooter, 300 years. Great kid, big mistakes in his life. He's currently in prison. He's turned it around completely. But that's a sentence that says to a child, we believe you have no capacity to change, and we're going to throw you away. I didn't understand how we can look at these kids for the first however many years of their lives and see the fact that adults have abandoned them and they're in foster care, and see that adults have molested them sexually and physically, to see that none of them have fathers, and to realize that adults have failed them their entire lives. But the day they commit a crime, we stop caring. Our hearts stop pouring out for them. We put them in a prison. We give them substandard representation. They're all brown and black. I haven't seen a white kid in my class in juvenile hall in 8 years. And we throw them into a prison system where they just get eaten alive. One of last few days I've been in Ironwood Prison, which Sandra mentioned. It's got the largest college program in the state. We have 400 youngsters in full-time college, and we have them all housed in a building together, so they're in a positive environment in college. And there's a kid there named John Rodriguez, and we just started a month ago the first Inside Out Writers class in an adult prison for all the kids that used to be in the Inside Out Writers program when they were in juvenile hall. And it's the kids, the inmates, that wanted to start the program so they could bring back those memories of what it was like, except now they're teaching it. And to watch John teach that class, to watch a former kid who committed a crime, who's now in prison for 22 years, teaching a bunch of other inmates, some 18 years old, some 35 years old, was incredible. But tonight, to see Dennis and Amy walk in, who were John's teachers. Dennis was John's teacher at Venice High School. And when John read his piece 2 days ago at Ironwood, I think the line was something like, I didn't know I had any talent in writing until some Jew taught me. And that's Dennis right there. And you should be so proud of him because he taught that class and he was just exceptional. This weekend, This weekend at Ironwood, we're having the first ever TED Talks in a California prison. And we have 10 inmates delivering TED Talks, as well as 20 outside VIP guests, including congressmen and interesting people. But I'd read 5 years ago a blog on Virgin.com that Richard Branson wrote about hiring former offenders and why other CEOs should follow in his footsteps. And I cold called him. And he's flying his private plane into the Blythe, California airport from London to come speak at a TED Talk for 30 minutes. And that's this weekend. So we currently, other than Inside Out Writers, I started a nonprofit that I'm working on right now before we launch the film company. That is a group of 160 former offenders, all who are promising to be crime-free, drug-free, gang-free, working or in school and willing to be of service and give back. James Anderson was our first full-time employee. Our organization is twofold. Half the organization is providing support services for folks coming out of incarceration. We're launching a major housing initiative with the community colleges to get them housed and in a supportive, positive environment. And the other initiative is policy work. We co-authored a bill called SB 260 last year that looked at juveniles who were given life sentences. The bill, if passed, would have affected 6,500 kids. We had James and about 40 other members who were all formerly incarcerated going there and saying, this is who I was when I was a child, this is when I changed, and this is who I am now. We had former gang members turn doctors, cardiologists, radiologists. We got 9 Republicans. We passed with a wide margin, and Jerry Brown signed the bill on day 2. And now David Negretti, who got 300 years, I could walk into the prison, look him in the eye, and say, guess what? You have a parole hearing in 10 years. and now he has hope. And so the other part of our organization is to change the laws and give people hope and the chance to go home. Thank you.
Incredible work. And I have to ask, Scott, you alluded to the interest in making different kinds of films. Can you talk a little bit about what you envision there?
We're raising a hopefully $50 million fund to make films of real kind of substance as it relates to social issues. And it's not something, I do believe that things can be entertaining and also have a great message. So I'm not saying we're not going to entertain and there's not going to be commercial features. But I'd love to roll out a lot of documentaries. I'd love to do television. I'd love to do stuff digitally and online, as well as big, huge features. There's been some really interesting people that came to the table. When the Hollywood Reporter piece came out about me leaving after 14 years, a couple celebrities came forward and said, we want to do this, and then a couple billionaires came forward and said, we want to do this, and somehow celebrities and billionaires go together pretty well. So there's actually people that really care and want to make a difference and tell these stories to move issues, whether it be education reform or environmental issues or criminal justice issues or issues involving children. So we're going to be focusing on those types of films.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, now let's hear from James.
It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today, and it touches home when I see these videos and I see these kids talking, because I remember being in those shoes. I remember sitting there and really feeling as though I had no hope left and there was no future that I could truly grasp within my hands. And at a young age, it didn't take me long to realize I was a slave before I was incarcerated, because the physical form of slavery is not the only slavery that exists. And especially in our time and day, and the form of suppression that is really pushed upon us, it's really mental and it's strong. And I was a slave to my conditions at home. I was a slave to the reality I had to walk home to every single day. And just to give you a little background, as we speak about these guys that are incarcerated, that are constantly being thrown in there, they're in there for a reason, and oftentimes because of the trauma and the abuse that they go through throughout their life. I was just at a conference this Monday, and it was with a lot of neuroscientists, and they were talking about the brain function, the way it works, and how a healthy child uses the frontal cortex of its mind, and the way, they're all technical terms, and how basically he was able to use his logic reasoning to make decisions, and how kids that have been abused use their emotional. And at that time, and that age, are they responsible for that? Because they don't have control over that. It's because of what they've been through. And I remember growing up as a child, most kids come home to a family that's decent, but my reality was as soon as I entered through those doors, I realized the abuse was going to begin again. I realized I was once again going to be beaten. And as I would come home and my father, my mother, and my brother would release their anger upon me, I used to ask myself, what was wrong with me? Because it couldn't be all three of them. Apparently it had to be something wrong with myself. And I remember at this young age, I started going into this dark circle because no matter what I could do, I could never achieve their approval. And it started to continue and move forward until finally my parents divorced, and I found myself living in a household with my older brother and my father. And at this time, things really became dark and ugly, and my brother became deeply addicted to crystal meth and involved in gangs. And once again, we're trapped within the drugs, we're trapped within the pain. And I found myself coming home to a brother that beat me half to death when he would go on these rampages, to a father that locked himself in his room at 10 o'clock at night and asked me how my day was going. So at the age of 14, I became deeply addicted to crystal meth, and I became involved in gangs. And I lost the hope for the future. There was nobody else to reach out to me. There was nobody there to tell me everything was going to be okay or that we could move forward in life. And it got to the point where at a young age, I decided to take my life. And I remember going inside the kitchen counter, and I remember emptying this pill bottle in my hand and swallowing. And I started going in out of consciousness, and I realized, wait a minute, I didn't want to die. I wanted to survive. And my father came in through the house. I ran to him, and I said, Father, can you please take me to the hospital? And I remember the anger he had because I had punched a hole in the wall. As he started to beat me, he told me, if you want to die so bad now, you're going to have to deal with it. I remember he walked in his room, locked the door, and next 3 days I was in horrible condition. And I survived, and the only thing that I could keep in my mind was the fact that, not that I survived that ordeal, but the fact that in the moment of most need, my father would turn his back on me. And at that moment I realized, if he didn't care about me, why should I care about myself? And this is where the beginning of the incarceration system begins, because I started going in and out, and there's no support. There's no real reason to come back home, all the way up until when I was 17 years old. And they used to ask me, Anderson, don't you want to go home? And I said, go home to what? What are you sending me home to? Because whether I'm here or I'm home, I'm still a slave to the system. I'm still a slave to the environment that I have to belong to. And at this point, I was one of the most violent guys in the facility. I was completely committed to my gang. And it's funny, everybody used to point at me and say, forget about him, he's never going to change. But I was able to change because one person came and helped bring love into my life. You see, it was more powerful than just emotion, because what they did was not only break the chains, the physical chains, but the mental chains I had within my mind. This suppression that I had built within myself from everything I experienced in my life to believe I was never going to be able to amount to something. And that is what gave me the power to move forward. And I came home 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, and this June will actually be 2 years. And it's been such a blessing of what can happen when you free someone of those chains. Because now I've traveled the country, I've been on a plane 28 times, full-time student transfer, UCLA if God allows. And all in all, because of being able to break this consciousness, right? So it's so important for us to continue this conversation and to help other people understand that we are there for them. I mean, Scott, once I went to CYA, which is the prison system for juveniles here, I was lost, and it was kind of hard to navigate. Now I realized I wanted to change my life, but there was nobody to grab out to, and luckily I saw him, and we started having a conversation. I was like, who is this white guy that's coming in here? What's going on? And real skeptical, because like many people say, well, it's hard to work with your population and gain their trust. And I'm like, well, if every adult in your life had abused you, you'd be the same way. And it's always a real skeptical process, but he won my heart over. And being able to see other people engage in this conversation helped me to get past so many issues. Because when people come home from jail, I remember Tupac says, you don't have to be in jail to be doing time. And that's so important to me, because the greatest tool I could give someone when they come home is all these resources. That's amazing. You can give them a great job. You can give them a great house, a car, an education. But if he's not freed within his mind, it means nothing. So when I speak to these guys, I want them to understand, even if you live in your neighborhood, we have to break these chains that they put upon us, these chains of we're not worth anything. We can't succeed because we can. And we have to stand here and realize, as a child, I was always told, we're unbreakable, we're unbreakable. I understand that it's powerful and it's strong for us to remain that way. But let's not be foolish to understand, we cannot continue to expect our children of color to remain unbreakable while they're sweeping pieces of themselves off the ground. We have to stand up for them, and it's now that we have to stand up for them. Not yesterday, not tomorrow, but today. Thank you.
So James, you have such an amazing story, and I'd love to hear if you're willing to share about that moment of transformation. You mentioned that someone came into your life, and can you talk a little bit more about that?
It's so amazing, because honestly, it only takes one person, and it can be anybody, right? So out of everybody's story that has changed their life, a few is they had a child, but the majority of it, and even that child is one person. It's always one person comes into their life and changes it. So for me, it was really an individual that's surprising, because before I was incarcerated, I would drift into church every now and then, and of course I would go in high and drunk, but there's this one person that caught their attention upon me, and for some reason she realized that this kid had potential. And it was so bizarre, because in my mind, when someone wants to pay me attention, it's because they pity me or they want to use me. And honestly, it took 18 months, which is a long 18 months, times when I pushed her back, times when I told her, don't show me pity, I don't need you in my life, to break through. And the fact that they tell me, what's the greatest thing we could do? And they say, we want to be a mentor. The greatest thing you could do is show up. It's the greatest thing you could do. And that's what she did. And after 18 months, I realized she's here not because I have anything to offer, not because she wants to take anything away from me, and not because she pities me, but because she loves me. And that was enough to touch my heart very deep.
Thank you. So now we're going to hear from Neal Baer, and we're going to start with one of his clips from Law & Order SVU.
I'm glad someone's finally airing the prison system's dirty laundry. Are you buying Donovan's BS? Humans are social creatures. Prolonged isolation warps our humanity.
That's what happened to you, Munch? Donovan is a hard man. I mean, he's playing like a little alone time made him crazy. Give me a break.
The Brits did a study of solitary confinement. They found it causes psychosis. They stopped using it.
You gotta control the prison somehow. Hall's a good way to do it.
Funny, when some prisons stopped using isolation, inmate violence went down.
You stop treating convicts like animals, they act like men. I'll buy that, but that does not mean solitary is torture.
Then why was it the preferred method of torture used on the hostages in Iran, the POWs in Vietnam, and at Abu Ghraib? The mind can survive prison, but we're not wired to be alone.
When I was in prison undercover, the worst part was never being alone. No private time, no quiet time, even on the toilet. I would have killed to do a stint in the hole.
We buy free-range chickens because we believe they're healthier, not being trapped in cages. We care more about poultry than people.
You want to take video on Donovan? He threw me off a roof.
This is a smokescreen to make the jury forget what this is really about. He tried to kill a cop.
The blue wall should remind him.
Okay.
Thanks for coming tonight. When we did that show, I had started to read a lot about solitary confinement and its impact on individuals in the prison system. And as Munch stated, that was all from the research that we did, that it is not a very humane approach to controlling populations. It certainly can control in certain ways, and it can kill. So ultimately, in that episode, Maloney's character tries it and becomes psychotic after several days. And so we're really fortunate on our show and as storytellers that we can tell these stories that can have impact. And we, several that we did on prisons, one was that's been talked about. The issue is we did a show in 2002 about a kid who was 14 years old who gave a knife to a 12-year-old because he wanted to be the 12-year-old's friend, and the 12-year-old killed a woman in a robbery, and the 14-year-old went to prison for life. Now, fortunately, and that was based on a true story, now, fortunately, the Supreme Court ruled recently that you can't incarcerate children for life, but there's, a lot of kids who are still in prison, and so each state is going through what Scott was talking about, trying to get kids out who've been incarcerated, because only the United States and I believe Somalia incarcerate children for life. So what does that say? The United States has 25% of all prisoners in the world. So what does that say about our preferred method of social control and punishment? We did a show also that I think touched me, which was about, and you were just speaking about it, is that there's a lot of really interesting research going on about the development of adolescent brains and adolescence and the law. And so Massachusetts General is doing really interesting work on the neurobiology of adolescence and the law, and it turns out that the legal system is really not designed to deal well with adolescents and their brain development, and we apply adult standards to adolescent brains, and it's really problematic because a lot of research shows that cognitively young adults really don't have that full frontal cortex development until they're 25 years old, and yet we treat 14-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds as if they're adults and can make those decisions. And so what does that say about the legal system and as we learn more and more neurobiologically? So as storytellers, we're able to talk about these issues and in ways that can bring a face to the subject. What I liked about that scene was that each person, Ice, Mariska, Chris, and Belzer, had different perspectives, which is really what's wonderful about what we do as dramatists, because we can take that all of those strands and we can weave them together almost three-dimensionally in ways that we can't do in any other kind of art form. We can have all of the different pieces and we can put it together, and the discussion ultimately led, as I said, Maloney to see for himself what solitary was like. So what we're doing now is I make documentary films along with the television that I do. And so our next project is based on the book by Matt Taibbi called The Divide. And so that book is out a couple weeks ago and on the New York Times bestseller list, which was really quite wonderful because it is about social justice in the United States. And it's pretty simply about why is it that if you steal tube socks, you can go to jail for a number of years, but if you fuck up the banks in the United States or around the world, you do not go to prison. And no one, and it's a pretty interesting book, and it really goes into Holder's work on banks and how that there was fear that after Enron and Arthur Andersen that they didn't want to cause too much trouble, for various banks and corporations. And so, why is it that if you are poor and you steal, you go to jail for sometimes many, many years, but if you're rich and steal and really have a much huger impact, you do not go to jail. And so that's what, so I recommend Matt's book. That's what the book is about, and so we're making a documentary with Alex Gibney soon about Matt's book, and Matt will be on the street kind of talking to people from those two very different walks of life and really exploring social justice in America. And it comes really down to that there are different applications of social justice in this country. And, I think a lot of people just aren't aware of it because it doesn't daily affect them. And it's, incumbent on us as storytellers to tell these stories, because as Scott was saying about his friend who saw 12 Years a Slave, a story really does change our soul, and it has the power to change, I think, minds more than anything else. We can't coerce people, really, and make them change their minds. We can't, force them with policy. It doesn't, always work because people react in ways that they don't like to be told. But if their heart is captured and captivated, and they're engaged by the stories that we tell, then there's a chance to have conversations about these issues and start talking. And so I was very, gratified to hear about all the work that the three of you are doing to tell the stories that can engage and captivate, because that, I believe, is really the primary way that we relate as human beings, through stories, that we can change things. So thank you for coming.
And I'd like to quickly add one statistic, Neal, that I think fits in great. To incarcerate a juvenile in California, it costs $200,000 a year. The recidivism rate is 75%, 74.6% for this population. So we spend $200,000 per kid to fail 7 of 10 times. In what company, how quickly would that company be shut down? It's ridiculous. So this is a movement. This issue has become a movement for both the left and the right. So in my bill, the greatest champion of my bill was Newt Gingrich. The second biggest, listen, there were a lot of progressive champions too, but these are the ones that really move the needle. Newt Gingrich wrote an op-ed in the Fresno Bee, basically saying, let these kids out. The other, this could be even more shocking, was Grover Norquist. Both of them not only talked about the big government and the complete waste of money, spending $12 billion in California on the prison system, but they both, in their op-eds and their letters, wrote about the human potential we're losing and wrote about redemption. And you get the Christian right, you get the fiscal right, you get the moral right. So there's a lot of, this is not kind of a liberal issue anymore. We're getting them all. And I think that's, if anyone kind of is wanting to write about these issues, this is not just a bleeding heart California, like we're in our bubble and we feel like, we feel strongly passionate about this, but nobody else does. There's ways to frame this where you get agreement across the aisle.
Wow, that's amazing. I wanted to ask one question of Neal. I know you've been so effective in using storytelling to move the needle on different issues. And I know you're also very interested in action taking and moving viewers to action. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So part of what our center does is, use the work that you as writers do. And you know that when you see a film that really moves you, that you're often inspired to do something, but you don't have a way to do it because you're not connected, or it takes too much time to go to the internet or whatever, and then that spark dissipates fairly quickly. So we're developing at UCLA a social networking site called Action Lab that, say you see a show about juvenile justice and the issues that Scott raised, we would give you immediately action steps that you could take, from writing Congress people to visiting prisons to seeing stories of real people, of volunteering to work in the writing workshops, but connecting people using the springboard of art to get them going. And so the more one writes about these issues, the more we can then, we hope, captivate people and give them actionable steps. And I think it's really important to give people actionable steps, because even then it's hard to know what to do. But as Scott just said, well, one thing you can do is you can volunteer. And if you volunteer, you're going to see what's going on, and then you're going to tell your friends, and it has a life of its own, that it becomes dynamic and it grows. And so we're really interested in providing people on all kinds of social issue topics how they can take action to do something that really moves them. And there's so many different ways one could get involved just on this issue that have just been described by everyone. So we're working on that. So look for that, I think maybe by October, actionlab.org. And it'll be connected to documentaries, and we're hopefully working with Sundance too, and so that, whatever the topic is, we can connect you. If it's like, I just did a film about kids who build a farmer's market in the poorest county in North Carolina. If you get inspired, then we'll tell you how to build a farmer's market in your community. So it's a way of really using our work as a springboard to action.
And also, I think it could be fun if people are interested. I don't care if it's 2 people or 20 people. We could spend one day or even a half day visiting a juvenile hall, county jail downtown, or even a state prison. We have all 3 of these things in Los Angeles County. And you could find some pretty intense stories and some really inspiring stories. So happy to, if we could coordinate it, happy to take a coalition of folks around and do some interesting touring.
You should do that on as Sandra said, we have a bus called the Story Tour, and we've taken writers from here to South Central LA to see clinics, or to places that, how many of you have been to Vernon, or, has anyone been to Vernon? So you've been to Vernon, so 3 people. So Vernon's in Los Angeles County. We took writers to Vernon, which is where the rendering plants are, and people live right next to them, and they're exposed to all kinds of toxic waste. And so, we live in this very dynamic, vibrant community, and so we like to take writers. We love having writers come to seminars, but we also like taking writers to the stories because it's so impactful. So as Scott said, I'm sure that Sandra can arrange to do a story tour of juvenile justice.
I gotta add, I just want to add to that I think for me it was really inspiring to hear that ARC was doing such amazing work here in California, and work that really mirrored in many ways the work that Center for New Leadership is doing in Brooklyn. And I think it's just so important for us to be more aware of what folks are doing, so you don't feel like you're in these silos, you're all by yourself, you know what I'm saying, doing the work on your own. But to hear at this work back home, a lot of it is around the raise the age of criminal liability. New York and North Carolina are the only 2 states that automatically confine you as an adult at 16 years old. Around stop and frisk, we actually were able to sort of to win this trial against NYPD recently for stop and frisk record numbers, and I think that's an important piece of it. And New Leadership's, as a poet, as a writer myself, I also think about language a great deal. And there's a great piece, Eddie Ellis, the founder of New Leadership, who spent over 20 years incarcerated, has this really powerful language letter that Danny Glover actually recorded recently. We're putting it on this mixtape we're about to release. But it talks about the language, changing the language, and not using the language of convict and felon and ex-convict, or using the language of focusing on the humanity of folks, so that we actually are focusing on calling folks incarcerated people, or formerly incarcerated people, incarcerated youth, and changing that language can change the conversation and change the consciousness, which has to be changed with the policy, right? Because we know from history that if we only change the laws, we don't also capture the hearts and the minds of folks in the way that all these stories have, right? You got to send the National Guard in so the little black girls can go to school, you know what I'm saying? So I think that's part of the struggle as well, is really figuring out how we can learn from each other's best practices, from New York to LA to Texas, around the country, and really kind of build this movement into more than it is right now. And one last quick story that I want to share on that note, Juan Gonzalez, who wrote History of Race in American Media, I interviewed him, and he told us an amazing story about Dr. King organizing with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he said, that Dr. King used to have these strategy sessions, and they used to have all the organizers and all the activist folks sort of in this room, sort of like coming up with the plan for what they were going to do, the action steps. And then at the end of the meeting, there was a radio station upstairs, and Dr. King would take the broom, and he would bang on the ceiling with the broom, and he'd go, like this, so the DJ could like take the microphone and lower it out the window. And then he would like lower the microphone to Dr. King, and Dr. King would make a speech, and yes, we need to do this and that and third, and everybody, and then Dr. King would take the broom again and bang on the thing, and the DJ would roll the microphone up and then put the announcement out. And that for me was just a really amazing story that captured some of the synergy, the connection between artists, the DJs, and the activists, the organizers, and I think that is often lost in the conversation. That's a powerful synergy that I think we need to celebrate and honor and encourage and cultivate as much as we can.
Now it's your turn, so we'd love to hear your questions. There are a couple of mics here in the aisles, and the floor is open.
Thanks for coming today. My name's Monique. I'm an associate producer on a documentary that's coming out called Lost Compassion about Mitresa Richardson. And this is a young African-American woman who was arrested for not paying a restaurant bill. And her mother said, keep her there, and it was in Malibu. I'll pick her up. She's not going anywhere. And they released her in the middle of the night, and then she wasn't found alive. Her remains were found about a year later, clothes strewn around, and the parents won a negligence lawsuit. But my question is, when it comes to being arrested or even being inquired about if you're in the car or whatnot, there's so many stories about law enforcers abusing people, rapes even, and I'd like to know, as you are working on your issue, the law enforcers, I'm just surprised that so many of these instances happen. The abuse of who is supposed to be your protectors out there on the road and in the jails. And I'm just wondering if you could make any light to this, because I truly don't understand. It's not even like there's a love relationship happening. It's abuse, it's force. And I'd like to know if you're looking into this, because it happens on the streets and then it happens in the jails. And there absolutely needs to be more sensitivity training, but I guess what it boils down to is the values of the people coming into the system, and how can we change that? Thanks.
Before I turn it over to the two experts, the Harvard law student here that was handcuffed, racially profiled, handcuffed, and arrested, and they had the wrong guy, and this guy who's had some police experience. I think it's a cultural issue. I can tell you some great cops and some great prison guards who really believe in rehabilitation and are helping me in every prison roll out incredible programs because they believe that inmates can transform, but they're in the minority. And their own fellow colleagues call them inmate huggers, call them wimps, call them pussies, but they exist. So I just want to make sure we don't demonize an entire group of folks, because I wouldn't be able to do what I do inside the prisons if it wasn't for them. But there's just an awful culture within the correctional officers, an awful culture within the police department. And I don't know if most people don't know this, but I'm the jail volunteer that exposed the beatings within Men's Central Jail, which launched an entire series of firings. There's 20 deputies indicted. Sheriff Baca has now resigned. And it's just a pure cultural issue where there's a large group of deputies and cops and correctional officers that believes these guys are pieces of shit. They're in here to be punished. It's their job to punish them. And they can't change, and they will never change. And we have 160 members that tell them they're wrong. And we also, we all have a collective blame of perpetuating the stereotypes in our business. If every night on the news you didn't hear about murders and the public didn't get so scared, we wouldn't have these laws. So I think it's our ability, I think it's our we really need to take control and tell both sides of the story. We can tell about violence, and people are violent, and those stories can be told, but we should also talk about how people can change. And we should also talk about redemption. Bryonn, James?
Just to touch base on that as well, it truly is a cultural thing, like Scott says, because of how far back generationally it's gone within their own constructs, and it became like a gang, basically, in the way they think and the way they maneuver. Because sometimes the race gets out of the picture, because I've also had black and Mexican cops that were just as racially abusive as a white cop was to me. And honestly, it's really the way they were created to think. And I became friends with a lot of them. I'm close friends with a lot of probation officers and a lot of sheriffs. And it's because there are good ones, right? But the truth is, when they come into this training, they're immediately surrounded by these other individuals that train them to think, show them no love, show them no weakness. I mean, everything, it's so eerie. It's everything we hear when we get into a gang, and everything that they teach us to show. And it's this cycle that has continued. And just as an activist of today, we have to tackle the situation in a different way. And it is being addressed. But one thing that you have to really strive to not do is cause a division. Because that's the reason why we're in this mess, because we've been divided so many times. So if we say cops are bad and we're over here and you guys need to change, I realize that hasn't worked, because all you're met with is opposition. Instead of saying, let's bring them to the table and let's see what we can do together. And involving them in the conversation and involving them. And of course, there are people that need to be brought to justice. There's crimes that need to be brought to light. And it's changing the way people are thinking about the whole entire issue, because there's a facility that's being built right now called Kilpatrick, and they knocked down a camp and they're going to rebuild it. And I have a committee meeting to go to next Tuesday, and they're allowing us to come to the table to say how we believe this program should be set up, how the staffing should be set up. So now they are thinking, wait a minute, they're not trained to deal with the population, especially the juveniles. They're not trained to deal with the trauma that they're going through, and they're not even. They go through no training besides the same training a CO would go through to deal with adults. So the difference is that people are focused on that, and they're realizing that these institutions need to be built with people that actually care about the kids, because they're spending more time with the kids than anybody else, and they need to train them properly to deal with the traumatic issues that these juveniles are dealing with.
I mean, the culture of racism is as American as apple pie, right? And we can't deny that. 3/5 of a human being, like we were called less than human, right? If people are seen as less than human beings, right, then you can have a culture that actually dehumanizes and treats people, like chattel, like they're less than people. And I think that's a part of our history that is uncomfortable, but sometimes the conversations that make us feel most uncomfortable are the conversations we need most to have, right? And I think that's a part of the reality right now. The war on drugs was a very effective marketing campaign for the prison industrial complex, in the way that the war on terror was a very effective marketing campaign for the military industrial complex. People made a lot of money off of the 5,000 American lives that were lost in that Iraq war, right? Halliburton got paid, right? All those weapons, there was a huge payday for a whole lot of folks, right? So all the companies, you can go to normalprisons.org, you can see all the corporations that benefit. Starbucks is in the prison game now. Got folks making their holiday products. Every latte you drink, right? There's some money going to feed this industry. So I think that can happen because we allow, Chomsky talked about in the 70s manufacturing consent, right? The idea that if you get the public riled up around, the fear of certain people, who are not seen as less than people, seen as savages, seen as subhuman in some way, we can get people rallying behind and voting for the wrong thing. So we need to actually use the tools that we have at our disposal to change that awareness, right? To humanize folks that have been dehumanized. And I think that's part of the mission of writers in this work.
Hi, my name is Polly. I just wanted to know, is this kind of program is being implemented in women's prisons too? Because one statistic is that more and more women, especially minorities, are getting incarcerated. So, I wonder if, there are a lot of, I teach a lot of kids, I teach art to one of the things I do, but I volunteer to teach art to kids who are with one foot in the prison system. So, and there are a lot of girls. So I just wanted to know if your program is going to also go to.
Yeah, so in the juvenile halls, we have a lot of girls' classes Saturday mornings and Wednesday evenings. The girls are really, really tough. I thought the boys were tough, but when I tried to sub for the girls, it was just like a whole nother thing. I mean, it's really tough. I mean, the majority of them, probably 90% of them have been raped. Half of those have been raped by their own family members. So, I mean, can you imagine the lack of trust to any man? They're so sweet. They're so incredible to be with. They're a lot of fun. But they get out and they just have so many issues involving trauma. And it takes a long time. I mean, a job's not going to help. Going to college is not going to help. These are issues that are way deeper than that. So we can do all that, but you really have to work with them. And to be honest with you, it's like we have a bunch of women who teach the girls who are on the phone day and night putting out fires for these girls, and that's the solution. I mean, it's a person who's there, who's not going anywhere, who really cares, who's never going to leave your side, and that's how you get through the trauma. And it's incredible. And it happens in the women's prisons also. Tim Robbins runs a great nonprofit called the Actors Gang, and they teach in a bunch of the male prisons, but also in the women's prison. And they actually do Shakespeare, and it's pretty awesome.
My first experience actually in a women's facility was in Atlanta. Drove right past Morehouse and Spelman and went to the Fulton County Jail. And that was actually interesting to me because it was the first time. We've been doing poetry, hip-hop, theater, spoken word, and mostly at Rikers Island, which is the largest penal colony in the world, 12 to 15,000 people, 4 to 5,000 16 to 19-year-olds every year at Rikers. But we also traveled around for about 5 years and reached about half the states in the country. But in Atlanta, you know, it was the first time I experienced the COs who were actually like really vocally on our side. Like the female COs were like, that's right, the system wants you here. You need to get, your family's all broken up. And we were looking around like, what is going on? You know what I'm saying? They were like totally backing up everything we were saying. So talking about finding allies in unlikely places, you know what I'm saying? You really, it's that was an experience that happened in a women's facility that I really hadn't had elsewhere. But I also I know there's not enough folks doing this work. Women are the fastest demographic being incarcerated around the country. But whether it's women's facilities, youth facilities, adult facilities, there's not enough folks doing this work. So we need folks in all of these spaces to do it. And I know for me, one experience I had where it was actually the first time I was in a facility that was mostly white. Which was trippy for me because I was like, in the middle of the country, that's the reality. And House I Live In talks about meth and its impact across middle America. But in the Clark County Juvenile Facility in Springfield, Ohio, I'll never forget. I mean, it was, really the power of the word and of writing. And we did workshops using spoken word and poetry and hip hop. And I'll never forget this 15-year-old kid, James Kalinowski. He was sentenced to 98 days. In this juvenile facility. And we did a performance, showed some videos, had them writing, and I said, we're coming back later in the week to do a slam, to actually have y'all compete. We have a battle. And James requested to stay a 99th day so he could be in the poetry slam. And then he won. So he left with like the wind at his back and a whole different connection to language and to writing. And for me, the scriptures say, in the beginning was the Word and the Word was God. I never understood what that meant, but our words create a universe of possibilities, and so they're God-like in that sense. So the language we use to talk about each other, the language we use to communicate and to tell these stories, I think is so powerful, which is why we see in the immigration movement getting away from the language of illegal, right, and illegal alien, right? That language, changing the language that we use to talk about incarcerated folks, to really humanize folks that have been systematically dehumanized, is so important, And so I think it's a piece of this that it's not by chance that we connected because we were doing writing workshops and education around that in the prisons. I think it's a critical piece of opening our consciousness to new possibilities.
That in right now the volunteer work that I'm doing with formerly incarcerated is registering them to vote, especially on off elections. And the thing that I found when I started doing this about 5 or 6 years ago is that a lot of them could not read well enough to fill out the registration form, much less vote. And I found in talking to them that I realized that at least 70% of the prison population is there because they have learning deficits that started in school, and that, you know, they were the bad kids, they never got anything, they never got good at anything, and then they're in, especially if they were sentenced as youths and they stay in prison, they don't get any school. So when they come out, they can't even pass their GEDs, and then they've been lied to and told and all that. So anyway, yes, I've been following the program that James has been in Ironwood and everything. But what I kept hearing from these former inmates is that basically the guards, the majority of guards have maybe high school and maybe a couple of years at JC. They are not invested in the education programs because basically they don't want the inmates smarter than them. So the fact that we have these movements now and all that, the funding is very, very tight for it. Do you see that there is any organized resistance now to what we already know? It turns out to be the better economic model for putting people back on the streets to get them far more educated. Can you feel any national or organized resistance? Okay.
Yes. So if you asked me 3 years ago, the answer would be hell no. Governor Schwarzenegger cut $100 million out of the prison program budget 3 years in a row. So $300 million total, debt gone. It cut our entire college program. We had 6,000 inmates in college, and in one day they were all being told, guess what, you can't enroll next semester. And this was their identity at this point. They were college students. They were going to get released, and they were going to go into a 4-year university. And now they're being told it's all gone. In one phone call, we got 5 of the guys who had been released, who were in the prison college program and now in 4-year universities, and get on the phone with the pro tem of the Senate, Darrell Steinberg. And in one phone call of them telling their stories, $1.8 million was restored and the college program was back on track. It's a new time. The economy's better. Our state budget's better in California. So all this money that Governor Schwarzenegger cut is now being restored. So this budget looks very rosy right now. It's the May revise, so we'll see what the governor does. But it looks very, very good right now. Winds at our back. Tomorrow, I actually have to leave here in 10 minutes because tonight there's the launch dinner of the Ford Foundation's Correctional Education Initiative. Bryonn's coming with me also, where the Ford Foundation is announcing $25 million of private money to incentivize the government to match $25 million in state money to enroll 10,000 more inmates in college. And that will then the prison can use other resources to continue with the GED program, the literacy programs, and them themselves are using the restoration of the state budget to increase those programs. So if you looked 3 years ago, there were half as many GED classes and literacy classes in prison. They've now doubled, and I think by the end of this budget, we'll have tripled. So we're going to be in even better shape than we were before Governor Schwarzenegger started slashing. So I think the wind's at our backs right now. The pendulum is swung in our favor. The pendulum always swings back, and the economy always swings back. So it's now time to act.
To just echo sort of a comment from earlier, in New York, we also are having this conversation. Governor Cuomo announced that he would be reinitiating funding for prison education programs in 10 prisons across the state. There was huge backlash. Part of it was that he didn't do his due diligence in checking in with all of the players at every level. Did a horrible job, and so he's pulled back. It's actually not in the budget, but we know that the will is there. We know that there's some work to be done to do it, to politically make it happen in the right way. But it's unavoidable. This is now an issue that the governors across the country are having to deal with, having to face, because from every area of the political spectrum, there's a sense that something has to be done. Rikers, it's $167,000 a year to keep somebody incarcerated there, for the year, and the New York public school system pays $14,000 to $15,000 a year to educate young folks in public schools. So it's over 10 times the amount of money to lock somebody up. If they would just double the amount of resources they put into public schools, we'd already see a shift in change in what's happening with incarceration in the state. So I think that's part of the conversation that's happening across the country, and we need to all figure out. Everybody's not going to be storming the barricade with a megahorn and chaining themselves to the buildings, but everybody can have some role in moving this thing forward. And it's for each of us, I think, to leave with an assignment. What can each of us do to actually get plugged in, whether it's mentoring or volunteering or being involved on social media? There's some way for each of us to be involved to move this thing forward in the right direction.
It's all about framing. Governor Cuomo would have framed this properly or learned something about storytelling from this crowd, he would have easily done this. You know the Republicans and the prison guards are going to come back with, well, why should they get college if my kid doesn't get college? But that's all misinformation, and it's all wrong, and the benefit and the low recidivism rates and the amount of savings you get from doing that so 20 times outweighs the amount you spend. But if you don't frame it properly, you don't tell the right story from the beginning, it crashes and burns.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Denise, and I'm a writer, and I'm just really adamant about using my gift to write about things that promote social change, so I'm really glad to be here today. And my questions, I have two. One is ARC. How are you involved, if at all, in rescinding the 3 strikes law or doing something about that? And two, there's a recent story in the news about a gentleman who had been forgotten in St. Louis, and they neglected to have him report to prison. So in the 13 years that they had forgotten him, he kind of changed his life around. And then they realized they had forgotten about him, and they came and got him and took him to prison 13 years later. And just recently, today, the judge let him go and said it's too late. So I don't know if you've heard about that, but how do you feel that that can be used as a way to show that prison isn't always the only way to rehabilitate an individual?
So luckily, we don't have to do anything with the 3 strikes thing because it was a ballot measure last year, and the public overwhelmingly supported it 70% to 30%. And this was the same ballot measure that got killed when Governor Schwarzenegger was in office. So there are 3 strikes inmates whose 3rd strike was not serious or violent being released in droves right now. The thing to focus on, I think, is in November, there's going to be a ballot initiative that talk about unlikely allies, that the district attorney of San Francisco, so yes, it's the People's Republic of San Francisco, but he is the district attorney. His job is to put people in prison. The district attorney of San Francisco is authored a ballot measure that's going to take 6 drug felonies and make them misdemeanors. What that would do the day, if the public votes for that ballot measure, it would immediately release 12,000 people. I think that's the number, 12,000 people from prison in one moment who are there on nonviolent drug crimes where they should be getting treatment, not sitting in a prison around huge drug addicts and violent criminals. And it will also expunge 60,000 California citizens' records who have a felony on their record and can't get jobs because of it due to a drug crime. And that will be on the ballot in November.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. My name is Jeanette Miyamoto, and I'm with about 9 people from All Saints Church in Pasadena. And we are part of a small group who is studying and doing action in our community on this issue. We read the book, The New Jim Crow. And so we are really, I'm really grateful that this movement is really spreading, and thank you for spreading it. The question I have is, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the upcoming sheriff's election, and thank you for bringing that to light. That's just incredible.
It's funny. I guess it's stuff happening in the jails is not that funny, but it's interesting. Using the word interesting. It's interesting. When I wrote that declaration and it became public, I put a voice recorder in my car in case the sheriffs pulled me over. I put 6 cameras around my house, not scared of criminals, but scared of the sheriffs, and what the retaliation would look like. And my phone rang, and the voice on the other end was, "Hey, Scott, it's Lee Bacco. I'd like to meet you. Can you have lunch?" So I go down to downtown, and I have lunch the next day with Lee Bacco. And he says, I thought he was going to ban me from the jails, and he does the opposite. He says, "I want you in the jails 3 times more. I want you to help me. I see what you've done in the prisons. I want you to help me roll out education programs and college programs." And I then became his sidekick in the jails, and even as he was being taken down in the media and taken down for his negligence in overseeing the jails, I have a lot of love for him. because I believe in his core, he made some really boneheaded decisions in trusting people within his administration and losing sight of what he needed to do. But he really believed that education was the tool to get these guys out and to stay out. And he really put his money where his mouth was. As for the sheriff's election, I would start betting on Jim McDonnell, the current police chief of Long Beach. I've had a couple meals with him, and he's given me all the right signs that he's going to continue with the education programs and continue figuring out ways to divert people out of jail and to take mentally ill folks and send them to treatment, and people that commit drug crimes treatment rather than jailing them. And I also think the world of Bob Olmsted. He's very underfunded. He's a very small chance of winning because he can't raise the money that these other guys can. But he's sort of the hero in this story. He's the captain of the jail who went to Baca and kept telling him what was happening, and Baca was not listening and said, keep talking to Tanaka, keep talking to Tanaka, who happens to be the villain in the story who's also running. But Olmsted was the one that came public with everything. And he was the whistleblower, and now he's running. And I think the world of him. I think he's the hero in this story, and I think he should get a lot of support. So I'd be really happy if either of those guys won.
One quick one.
Okay. Yeah. Well, maybe this will be a good finish. I'm very curious to hear from all the experts, actually, what you think of the current portrayals of prison in the media, particularly television, with Orange and the New Black and Oz and other, but also features. And do they are they accurate, not accurate, and in terms of the cause that you're invested in, are they helpful or not helpful?
I want to ask my brother Divine Pryor to weigh in on this question, because I know he has some strong opinions and has spent you were sentenced to 800 years? Not quite. I really feel like he should definitely weigh in on this one.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Dr. Divine Pryor. I'm a forensic psychologist, and I run the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions, which is the world's only research, policy, advocacy, and training center that is run by formerly incarcerated professionals, representing every discipline from law to medicine. And so on that note, that's a heavy question. Let me say that a lot of what you see on TV is Hollywood. Right? I mean, I think that Scott alluded to the fact that, yes, there's going to be content and there's going to be accurate information, but because it's film, because it's on television and on the screen, there has to be, something in there that makes people laugh and makes you feel good. I'm always disturbed by movies like Oz and so forth, because these things are not really real. But I'll tell you what is real. What is real is that women in prisons across the United States, when they give birth to children while they're incarcerated, they're handcuffed to the bed. It is real that if you're in prison and you're a male and you look at a female correctional officer and she feels uncomfortable, if you say you look nice or you smell nice, that you could be put in segregated housing for reckless eyeballing. It is true that if the correctional officer comes by your cell and catches you fondling yourself, that you will be charged with destruction of state property. That's what's real. That's the stuff that's not going to make it on Oz. These are the real issues, the inhumane treatment, the degradation that's taking place in the prisons, all of the inhumanity that's a part of everyday life. But I'll tell you what's really sad is that there are also nuggets of humanity in prison. I was in prison. I didn't have 800. I had actually 118 years. I spent 10 in prison. I actually was able to write myself out of prison. It's a long story, but I was arrested on the 3rd floor of a 2-family house. You'll have to do the rest yourself. And what, I found is that even in prison, if you find someone who's humane, you can't reach out to them because it's against the culture of incarcerated people to actually share a humane moment with a human being because it's betrayal. So a prison is a very peculiar and a very awkward place because even in the midst of pain and suffering, if you find a kernel of humanity, you're prohibited from reaching out to it Otherwise, you'll be violating the very rules that govern that device. So it's, you know, I would like movies like Oz and them to really give up, you know, the essence of what's happening in prison, what's happening in human beings.
I like to add, too, that I think on TV we've never really seen something that was accurate about prison like The Wire was accurate.
Yeah.
Like The Wire was real. Yeah. So I haven't seen Orange is the New Black. I did not think Oz felt real at all.
No.
So I think that's kind of ripe for the picking.
But I wanted to take this moment to commend everyone on the panel. I think that all of y'all are just doing extraordinary work. I think that you are to be commended, you know, for the work you do. And I want to encourage you to continue to do the work. And I had a question, but the question left me. But I want to let you know that we have a lot of content for you to have. You know, I remember when the world was laughing, you know, my uncle was, you know, he was a pretty well-known comedian. And he... Richard Pryor. Yeah, Richard Pryor. And when he was telling jokes, if you listen closely, he was very political. Very, very conscious. But also there's another thing that was overlooked, that he was in pain. He was reaching out. But everybody was so busy laughing that no one, you know, saw that he was crying out, you know, for help. And I started getting into this work after, you know, he, you know, had his unfortunate situation with the fire. And I started investigating addiction. And that's how I started doing this work, and found out that, you know, the larger majority of people in prison are in prison not because they're bad people, but because they have issues in life, you know, and there's traumas and there's addiction. And the Center for Disease Control already defined addiction as a clinically diagnosed disease. So we're actually incarcerating people because they have a disease. So we have some issues that we need to handle. And I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
So, guys, there's nothing I'd rather do than talk to everyone here afterwards, and because whoever wants to volunteer, come on a tour, anything. But I needed to be downtown 7 minutes ago. So my email address, if anyone wants to reach out, is my first name, which is Scott, S-C-O-T-T. My organization, ARC, and then the letters LA for Los Angeles, Scott, ARCLA @gmail.com. Scott, ARCLA @gmail.com. Please reach out. I'd love to meet all of you and figure out how we can collaborate. Thank you.
And then another announcement, in line with the accuracy of storylines, that is why GMI exists. We are available to you to contact us anytime you're writing a storyline, whether you want to meet with real people with real stories, you want to go inside a prison or into a community, or you want to talk to an expert, we will connect you. So just if you want a story tour, you'd like to go behind bars, that's what we do. So please do reach out. I want to extend a very warm thank you to our incredible panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.
Leave my email address too.
Leave my email address too.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, Bryonn. Yeah, keep doing the work. Thank you all for being here tonight.